Hi class, Michael here with a short lecture on language shift, causes and history. I like the term language shift because it connotates a more back and forth, more gradation than just the term language endangerment. Language endangerment is a pretty unidirectional process that connotates, it has a negative connotation. And where language shift is also a detrimental experience for communities, it shows that it's not always that case, and it can a language that has experiences a loss of speakers can then see that change over time. So what do we know about language shift? Well, we know that shift happens. Language have been in flux since the earliest times, back 1.5 to 2.5 million years ago, when the first types of language was developed in the primate world. Human language is thought to have come around 200,000 years ago. And since that time, thousands of languages have been born and died, and no language that existed 200,000 years ago exists today. And it is most likely that no language that exists today will exist in another 200,000 years ago. Languages are just like anything else. They evolve and they change. And to expect them to remain static is certainly not the goal that we have here. We may want to document and retain knowledge of what those languages have been, but the goal is not necessarily that they remain static, just like we don't expect culture to remain static in itself. And as before, we've used the example from Old English. So Old English was used until the 12th century in Europe, and it would be nearly completely unintelligible to most people. However, in the process with Old English transitioning into what we think of as modern English, it isn't necessarily that the language was lost and that it was driven into extinction. It really just changed and shifted over time. And so, but that said, we are in a unique pattern, that we are seeing a rapid phase and process of language shift currently occurring that is likely without any precedent in human history. And this is where we get many of the parallels to loss of biological diversity, because those two are seen as really quite similar in their trajectory of both experiencing that exponential loss that has not been seen in any other time that we know of. Many communities feel like a dam has broken and their language along with it, their culture, are flooding away with great speed. And this is true in many places, and we will see great loss in the next 50 to 100 years in terms of the level of language diversity we see in this in the world. It may not be as dire as the 90% loss that many calculate, but that is going to be largely dependent on people like us and people who are in speaker communities around the world. So it's certainly not all doom and gloom. Shift is a two-way process. We can see evidence of new language creation and revival of extinct languages. And no one person can put their finger on the dam and stop what is happening without structural strategies towards revitalization. This is a little bit of a dated list, but I think it's still useful for thinking through. And these are some characteristics of language shift. And Crawford, the author, notes that language is the ultimate consensual institution. There are certainly many external factors that cause shift, such as genocide being one of the most direct, And we know that shift is complex and that those internal decisions and perception of language that community members have is one of the most critical factors. And this is a claim that I think has a lot of worth and a lot of accuracy, but it is also important to be critical with, because we know that those perceptions that individuals have and how they structure and the decisions they make about intergenerational language dissemination are key. But those external factors are also quite consequential. Now, what we know about thinking about hard power or soft power, those are terms that anthropology uses to look at influence and change. And if we're thinking about coercion and external forces that require shift, we may see a lot of resistance generated. Oftentimes when people are told to do something authoritatively, they resist and rebel. But if you can convince people that their language is worthless, then the shift can be quite quick. Choice of language in the home is certainly this is for number 2, a dramatic factor. We all know that the challenge of learning a language, it's quite hard. I'm still trying to learn second languages and more. Learning from infancy is the easiest. That's how we've all learned most of our language. And the decisions that parents make on a daily basis in the home is a simple but critical factor. And a variety of things from demographics, economics, mass media, prestige are all factors that influence home-based shift. For number 3, this is why the study of language and the study of change in language is interesting for anthropology. Language choices reflect social and cultural values. And so evidence of shift in language indicates those changing cultural values. One commonly, and so we can see that if there are differences in the way different cultural groups react to language transmission, that is going to be an interesting way to study and be able to articulate elements of processes of change within that culture, values, perceptions, ideologies. For number 4, this is a quote from Michael Krauss, who's one of the preeminent linguistic scholars around language documentation and who's responsible for a dramatic amount of increasing the overall knowledge of what's happening with loss of language diversity. And he said, "You cannot from the outside inculcate into people the will to revive or maintain their languages. It has to come from them, from themselves." End quote. Outside advocates are often essential parts to language revitalization. But they're not the only ones. Building up educational capacity and training of community members is essential. And there are no successful language programs that exist without the support of a community. And that's why when we read things like Shaylee Muehlman's points about retaining control of agendas in language communities, that is so important to consider. And number 5, just like many factors when we see increased education levels, increased wealth, people have more control over their destiny. And particularly when a community lacks their own specialized trained resources and specialists to help with that work, whether it's a linguist, a preservationist, or someone else, there is more emphasis on maintaining those positive relationships and hoping that communities can be able to build up their own capacity. External factors are really something we focus on in greater depth than those internal choices. Internal choices are more challenging and more complicated to investigate. And ideas, the kind of external versus internal, many of those internal decisions and choices get categorized within the term language ideology. And that's really a unique study area of its own. But for external policies, a range of factors, such as the national policies of a country, can impact language shift or loss. And in the U.S., the federal government has, as we know, had formal policies of assimilation and conquest for native populations, and other countries have done the same or worse. And we'll continue to come to this, looking at the boarding school model, looking at this idea of killing the Indian and saving the man, as we see in this picture here, and the overt and forceful process of assimilation that happened in this country. And really, the major difference here is that we saw a direct break in that pattern of intergenerational language dissemination. So students who went to boarding school were forced to speak English and punished for speaking their own native language. And once that generation returned home, their languages were seen as worse than useless, but shameful. So there we take back to this characteristic, we take that those external factors that precipitated this internal shift, which ends up becoming the more detrimental of all. And so when that generation returned home and thought of their languages as shameful, they didn't teach it to their children, and it didn't pass on. That created that break. Now, some of those children were able to learn from older generations, but most did not. And there were fewer opportunities for those generations to learn language in the home. And elsewhere, we've seen colonization, economics, war, missionaries are all responsible for forced shift. Economics is certainly another factor driving this as well. Revitalization is a form of positive language shift occurring worldwide, and it's important, but those to note, and those internal factors are certainly a major driver. And I think we can probably see globalization as both a force of positive and negative shift, depending on how it's enacted. Internal factors in shift. The way we think about and perceive our language is the largest factor in their survival. The study of this topic falls generally into that concept called language ideology. And many of those factors are actualized by the decisions parents make with children. This is not to say that people cannot learn later on, but mother tongue languages are a big deal for a reason. People make decisions about what language will allow job attainment, marriage, social cohesion, and status. Whether the language is accessible, cool, useful, people have the time to do it. Winning the hearts and minds was a war strategy of the U.S. in Vietnam, and it also has application here. However, I believe people are less likely to learn languages because they feel they should than if they have a reason to do so. And that's a major challenge of this field. It's that $1 million question that people continue to ask. What is it that is going to encourage and be the change agent for people to make different decisions? Well, when people feel that they should learn something, they often fail. And guilt sets in. Guilt over, and in Native communities, guilt is rampant already. We've got guilt over people feeling the lack of cultural identity, a lack of ability to speak a language, lack of ability to perform a culture. It's a common sentiment in many of the communities I work with. People are overly apologetic about something that they had no real chance to learn as a child. I think it's largely unproductive and detrimental. People need different motivations, and that is a challenging thing to determine. how do we incentivize learning language for the right reasons? We're going to not spend a lot of time on this, but it's important to recognize some of the ways of quantifying language shift. One of the most famous is Fishman's Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale. It's a little bit wonkish to read through and look at, but it is quite relevant and still widely used. Joshua Fishman published his book Reversing Language Shift in 1992, and the text dramatically changed the discourse around language shift and is largely responsible for building the academic and community-based engagement with language loss. We're not reading any Fishman text, but he is an important thinker on this topic. And he's most famous for creating this typology of shift to quantify loss. The scale can be used to chart progress towards revitalization as well. And he states that languages, which he calls X here, have a predictable pattern of usage that can gauge the health of that language. I think it's useful to consider where the language you're interested falls in this scale. This table shows another way of quantifying language shift by use in location and medium. Interview, participant observation, focus group, based qualitative data collection are all important ways to gauge the state of language shift, and it's important to determine markers for status in grants and other records to see what kind of progress you're making. And finally, language shift outcomes. So when we see language shift, there are lots of outcomes. One can be bilingualism. One potential result of language contact is a stable continuity for multiple languages in the same region. And as we'll read in the Mufwene text, his hypothesis is that language retain niches of utility where they can exist. Spanish and English in the U.S. are one such example. Another is Tanzania, that has both English and Kiswahili as official languages. English is the main language of government there and tourism and is used in many official contexts. However, Swahili is completely dominant in homes, on the street, and in the market. And I think Mufwene would argue that separate spheres of use do not necessarily compete. Another example is South Africa, that has 11 official languages and has been largely sheltered from massive language extinction. Remember stats like only 54 of the 2,035 African languages are extinct and 116 are highly endangered. Compare that to 80% of languages in native North America language endangerment. Competition is not the only factor. In Africa, extractive versus settler colonization, Pan-African pride, and high language diversity density are all other relevant factors there. Language death, certainly one outcome. On every populated continent, this has occurred for all of human history, and this is when languages are fully extinct. This can also be called language dormancy is another term, and that is often a preferred term because it connotates that they are not just have not died, but they are dormant or sleeping, and can be reawoken or revitalized or reconstructed. Pidgins and creoles. Not all language contact results in negative shift. At times, new languages are born from that contact. Pidgins are languages that are primarily used as a means of communication between people that do not share a common language. In the Pacific Northwest, Chinook jargon was formed as a combination of Nukta, Salish, Kwakwatl, and other languages to enable trade and communication. Pidgins have generally basic syntax rules and vocabulary, and over time they can become a creole, which are pidgins that have stabilized and become a mother tongue of new generations. Chinook jargon is an example that is still spoken by some and has its own unique revitalization efforts. Language revitalization, we're familiar with this topic. It looks different around the world and is being deployed with mixed success. It is an organized attempt to reverse negative language shift. And finally, resurrection or reconstruction is when we are bringing a language back from the dead or from its sleeping or dormancy stage. And Hebrew is the most famous example of a dead language that was resurrected with great success. In theory, any language with sufficient documentation can be resurrected, even if there is no documentation of how the language was actually spoken in terms of a audio or video based documentation. We've seen that with the Miami language in Ohio. Okay, thank you.